Hello, sword dude and dudettes. We're going to have a little discussion today commenting on a comment. So a while back, I commented on one of Robin Sword's videos, or actually a short. Now, Robin Swords is a really cool guy. Please go and check out all of his content. He is an artist when it comes to brevity when discussing swords and sword-related topics, and he's really good at discussing fencing in HEMA. So check him out if you're interested in learning more about swordsmanship and just the sort of topics that I'm interested in, learning more about swords and different sword discussions. And he had a really neat video talking about the difference between how types of swords, specifically straight and curved swords, perform in the thrust. It was short, it's very short, we'll link to it so that you can go and see his video, and I made a comment, and unlike my videos, which might only generate maybe 10, 20 comments after a popular video, he has a sizably larger audience, and my comment yielded more than 100 replies. So I thought this video would be a good opportunity to talk about some of those replies and just have a point of discussion because they're interesting and it's a good topic to discuss. So, verbatim, this is what I said in response to the cool video that Robin Swords produced. I said, no disagreement with any of Robin's points, but just to remind everyone that for unarmored settings, the energy loss in a thrust for a curved versus a straight blade is basically non-applicable. Humans are so squishy that unless you target something like the brain case, the sword is not going to meet enough resistance for this to factor in. Your average saber will penetrate till lethal depth with almost no effort if the most protection you have is a shirt. Now start adding layers of textile mail or heavier arrows and heavier armor, and the story will quickly change. And Robin was kind enough to heart that comment. That was very sweet. Right back at you, big guy. So this generated lots of discussions and comments, and I thought some of them were interesting enough that we can discuss it here. So this will be just a kind of fun, informal sword discussion. So some housekeeping. A lot of people seemed to be confused or take exception to my use of the term brain case, and please forgive me, that's jargon. I have a kind of biological medical background. So when looking at the anatomy of the skeleton, the head is made up of two major parts. You have the front, which are the facial bones, and then you have the back, which is called the brain pan, the neurocranium, or the brain case. So it's an old term, it's an 18th century term. I have been accused of having a very antiquated vocabulary before, so it could be jargon or it could just be old-timey speak. So if you want to sound like someone from the Revolutionary War, you can call this the brain case. But that is referring to the harder bones of the head rather than the kind of thinner, softer bones like you have here in your nasals or your zygomatic process or your maxilla up here. So that's what I was talking about. If you're thrusting at someone, if you just hit fleshy bits, it's just going to go right through, just like if you're at the mall and you're trying to get your earlobe pierced, there's very little resistance there. If you hit something like a rib, the blade will probably just skip off because a rib is basically a narrow cylinder and it doesn't have a good spot for the sword to dig into, and instead it'll just kind of scooch around and keep going. Whereas if you hit a very flat plane, like the frontal bone right here in your forehead, it's more likely to dig in and then has the opportunity to stop depending on the physics involved that we're talking about. So you have your big heavy bones here protecting your brain. You also have very big heavy bones in your hip, in your pelvis, your ilia, your sacrum. Those bones are large enough that they might offer more resistance than some of the other places in your body. Your sternum to some degree, but not quite as much. So those were the targets I was talking about as exceptions. For the rest of the targets that most people are going to be aiming, especially during a fight, the body is really quite squishy. We're kind of big sacks of watery flesh. And even if someone was holding a kitchen knife and you just walked forward onto the edge of their blade, think about the type of damage that would inflict on you. Then multiply that out over a big, sharp war sword. Same thing's going to happen. Let's see what other comments that we have here. So someone says, Armor Artist says, I got a katana and a straight version of a katana, and after cutting, then thrusting with both, I can't tell the difference between their performance. So that's a kind of interesting concept because it's often discussed, like what's the advantage of the curvature in a katana blade. Obviously, once upon a time in Japan, there were straight versions of swords called chokuto. There are later period versions of katana, sometimes made during the Muromachi or Edo period, which have no curvature, called mu-sori. They're less popular than the curved ones, so the question is, why was there this predilection to having curvature in them? In my experience, when it comes to thrusting, what Robin is talking about still remains true, that if you had the exact same sword and you took one and just bent it, it's going to perform less, it's going to transmit the force of the thrust less well than the curved sword, but the curved sword does afford you other options, and it might not reduce the capacity to thrust as much as you might think. So if you're willing to live with those compromises, maybe the advantages of the curvature are worth it, and so you can deal with a very minor scaling down in the ability to thrust. Mystic Marbles comments, absolutely. I was testing thrust with my 1796 replica recently on softish targets, and it goes through them like nothing. I did the same thing recently. We tested the LK Chen 1796, and in the thrust, even though it has a kind of hatchet tip and it's a very curved sword, it went through the rather light targets very easily.
All right.
I even tested the LK Chen Shamshir, which is one of the most curved single-handed swords I've ever used, and surprisingly to me, on the very first attempt at a thrust, which admittedly I did on a bit of a curved arc rather than straight ahead, I was able to land the target without any problem at all, and it made a very impressive pierce against the heavy water bottle I was using. All right, this comment is a little interesting. Rascal8112 says, interesting. At a curved sword would usually have more length for slashing, which wouldn't be as effective against armor in the first place. So, if you planned to fight people with little to no armor, curved is the better choice. Otherwise, straight. Then again, if they're unarmored, it's most likely peasants with spears. So, it's probably better to copy them and hope yours is longer. So, a bunch of things to unpack there. I think that the thrust of his discussion is use curved swords when you're in an unarmored context and use straight swords in an armored context. I don't think history necessarily bears this out. The curved versus straight debate isn't quite that distinct. So in very heavily armored times, so the medieval period, let's say looking at Europe, the Middle Eastern area, the Islamic world, China, Japan, India, there were differences in preferences of whether you'd use straight or curved blades, even during the most heavy configurations of armor. So during Ming China, during feudal Japan, during the High Middle Ages of Europe, there were differences in the opinion on what sword to use, even when everyone was wearing their heaviest types of armor. If anything, I would say that there seems to be a bias towards the preference of using sabers, so curved swords, when you have light cavalry. So the more likely you are to use light cavalry tactics and ponies, so the type of warfare that was common on the Eurasian steppe, was kind of the birthplace of the saber and seems to be where that type of military unit is useful. So not all types of terrain and not all types of war, whether you're using castles, whether the types of, again, geography allow for it, the more often that type of unit is incorporated into the military and has the ability to be deployed, the more often that you see curved sabers being used in that military force, in my opinion. Diane Pennypacker says, also the angle matters. There are certain thrusts where a curved sword is better at certain angles. Also, forward curved swords are amazing at thrusting. A yataghan that tilts forward, like a kukri, for example, which is why pistol-like grips are boss, too. So the first part is exactly what Robin was pointing out, that the curvature of the blade allows you to get at angles that a straight sword simply cannot. The point about the yataghan is well taken. There are different shaped yataghan, so keep in mind that you can't apply one point across all of them. But a yataghan's blade is often not just curved, but recurved. So it goes down, and then it tilts back up. And I happen to have an antique here. This is not the most dramatic example of one, but if you hold it, it's straight, and it goes down, and then the tip of it actually curves and points back up and comes in line with the thrust of the original grip, so that even though it's forward curved, it allows you to still perform thrusts that are basically in line with the direction of the grip, so that you're not losing the energy of the thrust, and you can still have the advantages of the curve of the blade. Exploding Ice says, key takeaway, curved swords are, quote, less efficient. But against squishy, soft things, less efficient is still lethal. And there's some truth to that. So this is kind of like if you cut off a limb. By the time your cutting ability is strong enough to remove a limb from someone, how much more cutting ability do you need? And so a lot of that cutting power comes down to being efficient in a fight. So if you take a big two-handed sword and you go, wah, and you're chopping someone's arm or leg off, that's great. But can you do the same thing with just a little whoop, just a little chop? And some swords are powerful enough cutters that you can do that even a very small action that you might be able to get away with just after a narrow parry, and then your riposte will come back in and leave a devastating wound against your opponent. So perhaps that is why you need to have that much cutting power, because you're intending to leave these really devastating and debilitating cuts. So these less efficient is always relative. It's less efficient compared to what, and is it still efficient enough to get the job done? And that Robin, of course, was just speaking within a little 20-second soundbite. So if he wanted to speak for an hour, he's definitely knowledgeable enough about the subject that he certainly could. My comment was just to kind of bring some of that context to the discussion, that the curved swords still, in almost every case, are plenty dangerous enough, especially if you're dealing in an unarmored context. Meliodrath says, almost like they were produced after armor. I believe this is a common misconception that sabers were only around in the age after the High Middle Ages, when the heaviest configurations of armor were in use. And it's true, in Europe, that's when they became most popular, especially in Western Europe. However, sabers have been in use, as we mentioned earlier, throughout a lot of different cultures for a long period of time, including during when the heaviest types of armor were in session, if we look in different parts of the world. In Eastern Europe, even in the mid-16th century, there were sabers that were in use in places like Hungary and Poland. However, the origin of sabers really start in the 7th century, so they predate even arming swords and longswords. So sabers have been in use a long time, and certainly when armor was still in use. So this is not only a modern phenomena. Okay, this comment says, not really. If you have armor, it is probably something strong enough to stop any sword thrust. Curved sword is still better because it is easier to hit the weak point in the armor. So this is suggesting that if we have a curved blade, so here I'll get out my killich, that since neither this sword or a straight sword is going to be able to pierce the armor, that you might as well have the curved one, because maybe this can sneak in and find the gap. I don't know that I agree with that. If you have a dedicated sword for fighting in armor. Usually the very tip of the sword is thicker and reinforced because that tip is going to have to bang around against heavy helmets, shoulder pads, a cuirass, etc., and potentially get damaged. And you want it thick enough to be able to possibly punch through something like mail underneath once you get into a gap. The only exception to that I would say is we recently read an account of an Englishman who traveled throughout the Middle East in the 17th century, and he commented that the swords of the Turks, so a sword just like this, a kilich, was better both in a naval context as well as on horseback against an armored foe than a rapier, whatever rapier means. So it could mean what you and I think of in the modern day as a rapier, it could mean a different type of sword. So in that specific scenario, he suggested that the swords that the Turks were using were superior against armored foes than the straight swords that he was talking about as a rapier, whether that's a side sword or some other type of thrusting rapier. However, in general, I don't think that a curved sword would necessarily be superior to a straight sword fighting against armored opponents. I don't think the curve affords anyone any superior advantage. Again, if you're fencing, maybe you can get a little bit more sneaky, but in general, I think most of the time we see that heavy armored fighting swords tend to be a little bit straighter than ones that are for fighting against less heavily armored fighting opponents. Ain Malloy says, it always depends. What do you mean saying unarmored? Because even 18th through 19th century uniforms giving surprisingly significant defense from cutting and thrusting, especially if you keep in mind how low was average quality of military blades at the period. And he's absolutely right. So when I said unarmored, I literally meant unarmored, because in many cases, especially if we're talking about HEMA and treaties, etc., they're talking about guys who are fighting literally in civilian clothing or in some cases fighting naked, bare-chested, etc. And if you have nothing on, then your flesh is not going to offer any resistance to the blade at all. But if you're talking about in a military context, yes, the uniforms that were given, especially if you're talking about going on campaign in the winter season and have big, thick, heavy coats, absolutely can offer resistance to lighter types of blade. Military swords, be they spadroon, be they officers' swords, be they military sabers, could have very, very thin foibles and varying degrees of quality, especially for the troopers examples that weren't being produced in the quality that a private purchase officer blade could have. And so you do hear accounts of someone trying to deliver a thrust against an opponent that has a big heavy coat on, and then the blade bending, in two as a result. So even clothing can be considered an armored type of opponent, depending on the situation. Yelling Frog 9351 says, as someone who doesn't know sword fighting, only thing I got from this is humans are so squishy. That's a good takeaway if you don't take anything else away. Humans are quite squishy. David comments, the last American combat sword was the M1913 patent saber. I'm going to use saber in quotes here, with a straight blade for thrusting. And that's correct. It was produced, but it never saw action. And that was the trend for pretty much all military swords right there at the turn of the 20th century. Everyone was moving away from cutting swords and trying to move towards swords for mounted combat using the point only. And this was a debate that went across the entire 19th century on if swords should be used for cutting or if they should emphasize the point. At the end of the period, the point kind of won out on that debate. And that was emphasized at the very end of the age when many nations came out with this dedicated kind of bar that just has a long point at the end of it. It's basically like a reimagined S-Talk from earlier periods. Duncan says, that's a lot of words to say. Armor is effective. It better be effective because in many cases, armor was very expensive. Okay, Mr. Molerat says, I refuse to believe a sword just cuts through any part of your body without even needing that much force. And then he laughs. So it depends, because not all swords are meant for cutting. There are small swords that are not very good at cutting at all. If we have a dedicated cutting sword, like this one is, it's not going to take very much force at all to lop off especially a small part of your body. Now, a light cut from a sword like this is not going to bisect someone's torso, but taking off a digit, taking off a wrist, taking off someone's ankle, I have seen modern both medical records and footage of people that have suffered radical amputations, so entirely transected limbs of much smaller blades, so things closer to the size of Bowie knives and kukris, from untrained combatants, to put it in perspective. The force delivered by a lever as big as a sword, especially when properly sharpened, is much more devastating, and I've done plenty of testing to show that to be the case. And again, we have records from battlefield surgeons from both the 19th century and even earlier to show that was the case. So Egos 5074 says, also nice part is easier to break a curved sword free, but at the same time easier to put a permanent bend in a curved blade if equal quantities of material are used. So this guy suggests that it's easier to free a curved sword. I assume he's referring to if giving points. So if you're giving a thrust, it's easier to free a curved blade. And that's something that's not discussed too much. I think that there may be some truth to that. In experimentation, I think that it's possible that depending on the tip geometry and depending on the type of the rest of the sword, that curved blades may have a slightly easier time freeing their tip, especially, again, if we're talking about in a cavalry context, than a straight sword like an arming sword, for instance. However, he says it might be easier to put a bend in a curved blade if the quantity of material is used. I don't know that is true. That's going to depend not only on the type of steel used and the heat treatment used in the sword, but on the actual geometry of the blade. A lot of sabers, so a lot of single-edged sword, have very, very thick spines, much thicker in many cases than the comparable thickness of than their equivalently wide double-edged swords. So in many cases, I'd say that they're more resilient to deformation than a similar size, or if in his case, equal quantities of material of double-edged sword. I'd say that the double-edged sword would actually have a greater chance of deformation than a similar length, similar amount of material single-edged sword. I think that the single-edged sword, depending on the type of sword we're talking about, may actually be a little bit more resilient to being damaged. Okay, Sir Dingo says, except for blades with extreme levels of curvature like a shamshir, there's effectively no difference in how much of the edge contacts the target in a cut. Other design aspects like the edge geometry, balance, weight, etc. are going to play far more significant role in cutting performance. The usefulness of curvature is more for utility than cutting advantage. So, yes, I think basically I agree with this point. I don't think that you can curve a blade so much that you're going to end up with reducing the contact area of the target that you come in contact with. So on the surface, I believe that to be true, unless you're ending up with even an axe, which might have a very curved bit at the end. Is by the time it reaches a target, the physics involved, the geometry involved is probably not going to make that much of a difference. But the curvature will interact with other things when it comes to how the strike is being made, and that can help with the type of strikes that you're doing, and that can make a bit of a difference in the cutting performance. Okay, Karsmaktovich says, none of that is of course to say that a thrust is inherently more lethal than a cut. A thrust has a narrow wound channel and such a precise point of entry that it's easier to miss a lethal target if you're not precise enough. If you are, it's very easy for that precision to be lethal. And it's true. I'd say in general you have different targets for your thrusts than you do for your cuts. Matt Easton had a video or two on this topic maybe a year or so ago. There's a distinction between what type of targets and what type of attacks might be debilitating or ending of a fight, and which ones might cause lethal damage. In general, cuts usually are targeted at the periphery of the body. So a cut might go to the wrist or the ankle or even the upper thigh or under the arm here. And it's possible that that might cause a lethal bleed out, but it also might just disable the opponent by cutting off their hand, and then they're no longer able to hold up their sword, and that will end the fight, or you can dispatch them afterwards. Whereas a thrust is much more likely to be central, to go after their, or should be central, going after their head, their throat, their upper torso, going after their lungs or their viscera and their abdomen. Those will not always have the stopping power of a cut, but they can still provide lethal damage, especially in an age where people are not able to receive modern medical attention within the next couple of hours. If you end up piercing your aorta, if you do not receive emergent care very soon, you are not long for this world. So both have their advantages and disadvantages. It again, if you're being assaulted by 4 guys and you need to keep them off of you, you may not be able to go and poke them. Only the threat of being run up on your blade may keep them away from you, just because no one's willing to have bleed out over the next 3 days by having a wounded liver. Whereas instead, if you have a big long sword and you can just keep on doing sweeping attacks and keep them away, they may be able to stay away, and if someone gets too close, you take them off at the shin. So different situations and different levels of attack, certainly. And most swords are compromised designs, whether they're straight or curved. The majority of swords across history can both cut and thrust, and it's just a matter of how well they can do one or the other or both. Shada says, that is actually something I wanted to know but never cared to ask. Thank you. Melee fighting is so much more exciting than shooting your neighbor. Well, I'm glad someone enjoyed this discussion. And we'll end it on this comment. Thrusts were especially good versus armor. That's why longswords were still a bit effective versus armored targets. There, you needed all the power you could get. So it's true, long swords, as we think of them, were certainly still used in the age of the, during, for instance, the 15th century, during the heaviest types of armor. And during that time, even though you could have 2 hands on a long sword, and we might see them being wielded in certain imagery from the period in a swinging sort of context, perhaps that would only be used to try and disarm your opponent. In all of the manuals we have from the period that are dedicated to going up against another heavily armored opponent, the sword is used in a more half-swording capacity, trying to use it more like a staff weapon and getting in close grappling, and then trying to use the tip of the longsword, which again is at that point usually very narrow but thick and reinforced, to be able to then jab it underneath a plate and get it into a gap and really skewer them, use the whole weight of it basically like a short spear to be able to stab the heavily armored foe. So I hope that proved interesting. So I hope that proved interesting to someone. Thanks again to Robin Swords for the content. Keep producing it, guys, and we'll see if we can come up with some interesting comments next time. Take care, everyone.